bro.
A doorbell-ringing stranger terrorizes a neighborhood.
Lock the door, check the deadbolt.
Something like out of a horror movie.
A mom fears for her life as her toddler watches.
This video is absolutely terrifying.
They pull a gun out and they force her up against the wall.
Oh no, stop, don't do it!
A violent assault in broad daylight.
People's lives are at stake here.
And spring breakers gone wild.
He's running away while in handcuffs.
The video is going viral on TikTok.
I don't really know what's going through their heads right now.
Close your phone.
Oh, please.
Jaw-dropping videos caught on camera.
What I'm looking for is the girl that's in the house. How are you? I'm gonna rape her and kill her.
It's a viral video that is so chilling, it puts an entire neighborhood on edge.
Lock the door, check the deadbolt just in case a stranger knocks on your front door.
The woman is home alone. She's doing the dishes.
I just rang your doorbell because I have a couple questions for you.
This creepy guy is standing at her door, just something like out of a horror movie.
I just have a couple questions for you. Are you sure? Are you positive? I just have a couple questions for you.
Repeating the same line over and over.
Are you sure? Are you positive? Are you sure?
The woman is terrified. She has no idea who this strange man is.
Are you sure?
She frantically dials her husband, who immediately hangs up so he can patch into the doorbell intercom.
So, who are you? What? Yeah? Who are you?
Her partner must be feeling so helpless. He's not home, and he's having this conversation through the Ring doorbell.
Who are you? Hey, I just had a couple questions. I just wanted to ask you about what I'm looking for is for the girl that's in the house to come out here because I'm gonna rape her and kill her.
He's the most calm, collected criminal I've ever seen.
You have her open the door?
He doesn't seem to be worried about the cops showing up, and he really just politely almost is asking to get inside the house to do terrible things.
The wife has dialed 911 and the operator is on the phone with her. But they don't know if the man is mentally unstable, high on something, or just evil.
Rape and kill the girl that's on the other side of this door when she lets me in. I want to rape her and kill her because I have a knife and a gun.
I would absolutely believe what he said 100%. Anyone who would lay out that they want to rape and kill me on a video camera is probably going to do it. I have to imagine in that moment, the husband is freaking out. This guy is standing there in this dingy tank top, scraggly beard, saying that he wants to rape and kill his wife. And then he continues to knock.
And I'm gonna knock on the door again.
This guy has a bag with him, and I can only imagine the contents of that bag are not good. Rope, tape, weapons. I imagine nothing good is in that bag.
I have a knife and a gun. And I'm gonna knock on the door again.
After making ominous threats, the man suddenly backs away. But is this really over?
Are you sure? No idea. What?
Kind of walking away from the house, mumbling to himself, looking back, trying to see any signs of life through the window or something.
What?
He doesn't appear to have a phone or earbuds in, so who could he be talking to?
Not knowing who the man is or where he went is harrowing. But at least his face is captured on the doorbell camera.
That same evening, this woman who was in the home immediately posts this to social media.
The video instantly goes viral.
Terrifying moments for a downtown Las Vegas homeowner who posted this video on social media.
They shared it on Facebook just so neighbors could be aware.
This video was shared online more than 78,000 times.
And that helps police track down the creepy stranger the very next morning.
An alert citizen recognizes him from the viral video. She sees him walking past her place of work and points him out to a police officer.
Standing on the corner, like at the crosswalk. And I'm like, wait, that's a guy I seen this morning.
He is identified as Christopher Sums, and police learn that he's wanted in 2 other states.
He's actually a fugitive from California and had been wanted there for stalking.
Sums is hit with multiple charges, including aggravated stalking and coercing with threat of force. He's ordered to get drug and alcohol counseling, but is found competent to stand trial and sentenced to up to 5 years. The woman he terrorized asks for privacy, but Karen Stewart, who is responsible for his arrest, is publicly honored.
Citizens being recognized for protecting our community.
People were creeped out by this video and wanted him arrested, so they were going to look for him however they could find him, and they did just that.
In New York, another woman is also confronted by frightening strangers as her 3-year-old watches.
As a mom, it would 100% have an impact on me.
We're looking at surveillance footage of the lobby of an apartment building. A mother is coming down the stairs with her 3-year-old son.
Something she's probably done dozens of times.
She sees 2 men standing in the lobby. At first, it seems like nothing to worry about, but cameras reveal they've been lurking here for more than an hour.
Looks like they're just waiting for the elevator, but then they turn, they pull a gun out, and they force her up against the wall. They point a gun at her, and then they point the gun at her son, and she's like, don't point the gun at my son.
As a mom to a 3-year-old, if something like this happened, it's the first thing you think about is your child. I can only imagine what she was feeling like, wanting to protect her child in this situation.
She has to imagine that these criminals are completely dangerous and not all there. And what could they do if they're willing to point a gun at a child?
They demand that she hand over everything she has and threaten to take her son if she doesn't.
If you're in this type of situation, let it all go. Whatever they want, just give it to them. Those items can be replaced later.
Panicked, she pleads for her son's life, but the men silence her. And to her horror, they tug at her little boy.
This video is absolutely terrifying.
With a gun pointed at her toddler, the petrified mom hands over her car keys, phone, and the cash in her wallet. And after a few nightmarish seconds, the men suddenly flee.
It could be possibly that they were waiting for the right person to victimize. And in this case, this is a mom who is holding the hand of her child, and that may be why they chose her.
To make their getaway, the men steal the mother's car. But first, they do something puzzling.
When they get to the car, they actually take the car seat out. Why they would take the time when they're stealing an actual car to remove the car seat, who knows?
As police hunt for the men, they turn to the local media for help.
Well, surveillance video out of the Bronx shows a pair of suspected thieves walking off with a single mom's belongings.
The traumatized mother speaks to reporters.
She told us he put his hand on her mouth and said, "Shut up, shut up, shut up." He put the gun to her body and she said, "Don't touch my son." But then they put the gun right against his head anyway.
Es el peor momento de mi vida.
The worst moment of your life.
Yeah.
For a child, it's a horrifying and potentially damaging experience.
3-year-olds are smart, and they come up with a lot of questions. And sometimes it's something that may come on years later.
This kid is going to remember this event for quite a while. And for however many years this kid's going to remember this event is probably how long you need to stay in jail.
As the story goes viral, people are outraged. Even the city's mayor weighs in. But 3 days later, police catch a break.
In this day and age of technology, investigators were able to track the vehicle through its GPS.
A few days later, police arrest one of the men, 23-year-old Carlos Guzman. He's charged with second-degree robbery and sentenced to 5 years. The second culprit, Wagner Argamonte, is arrested a month later and charged with first-degree robbery. Police believe it was a random attack.
This mother did nothing wrong. This child did nothing wrong. And unfortunately, they were victimized. It's in these types of situations, it doesn't matter how familiar you are with your surroundings sometimes, you just never know when you could become a victim.
And that's exactly what happens to this man in Maryland.
Gun?
Yeah, he has a gun, baby.
It's a brutal attack. Right in front of his family.
The family saying they do not know this man.
Let go!
Let him go!
Oh, no! Stop! Don't do it!
It begins when a man and woman passing by this apartment complex see something shocking.
Gun?
Yeah, he has a gun, baby.
They instinctively start recording on their cell phone. One of the men they are videotaping is Carlos Quezada. He's in the red shirt. He's just stepped out for the night with his family when the other man sneaks up behind him.
This all starts when Carlos is exiting his apartment complex. The gunman approaches him, instructs him to put his arms behind his back. He decides not to do so. He realizes the situation's gonna get bad, proceeds to fight the suspect over the gun.
No! Stop! Don't do it!
Carlos is pinned to the ground, and the gunman is holding a revolver right to his chest.
What are you doing, bro?
And then the gun goes off.
Carlos has been shot twice.
Horrified witnesses are gathering around watching these events unfold, kind of not knowing what to do.
Police are on the way, but the shooter keeps Carlos locked to the ground.
Oh, no! Stop! Don't do it!
It looks like he's trying to shoot Carlos again.
We're watching them wrestling on the ground until...
Don't do it!
We hear that gun click.
And amazingly, the gun misfires.
Now, brave bystanders seize the chance to help Carlos.
This is a really frantic scene. You got people screaming for help.
Ayúdale, ayúdale!
And you have multiple individuals fighting over a gun. It could go off in any direction. People's lives are at stake here.
They're holding the suspect there until police arrive.
One woman refuses to back down, even as others try to pull her away.
What we don't realize in that moment, though, is that that is the man's sister.
And Carlos's sister is enraged.
She's gonna do whatever she can to save her brother. This is obviously a traumatizing situation for the entire family. Nobody should ever witness this.
Carlos is rushed to the hospital. He's been shot in the leg and the chest and has a collapsed lung.
It's really incredible that Carlos survived this situation. When the firearm is later recovered, there is a live round still in the revolver.
The gunman is arrested immediately.
The shooter is identified as 24-year-old Marcus Elijah Conway.
He doesn't reveal why he shot Carlos, but he's hit with multiple charges, including attempted second-degree murder and first-degree assault. He is still awaiting trial, and it turns out he has 3 prior felony convictions.
So he should not have been in possession of a firearm. But as we know, most felons don't follow the rules.
The video of the harrowing scene goes viral as soon as it hits the news.
The man shot twice after leaving his apartment.
Good Samaritans are seen jumping in to help a man struggling with the person who just shot him.
The gunman put a revolver to her brother's head.
The victim's protective sister also speaks to reporters.
She tells me at first she froze in shock and then jumped out of the car screaming for help and trying to stop traffic as her brother struggled with the suspect on the ground.
People are stunned that so many bystanders risked their own lives to help Carlos.
I would absolutely consider these Good Samaritans heroes. They decided to act when they didn't have to. I'm glad they acted as fast as they did because I believe they saved Carlos's life.
In Florida, a different kind of attempt to save someone leads to viral infamy.
In this moment, these kids are thinking, oh, this is going to make a great TikTok.
What's your problem?
Oh, please.
It's spring break in Clearwater, Florida, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of college kids on the beach having a good time.
Which means a bunch of 19-year-olds drunk out of their mind, just living what they think is their best life on the beach. I feel bad for all the officers that found out they are working this week.
You're there in a bulletproof vest in 90-degree weather. It's not fun.
So this video kicks off with a fight.
3 people came up to me, they're like they wanted to fight me. Stop! Oh, bro! Sir, I was scared for my life.
You were on top of him, bro!
Which the police came to break this fight up and arrested some people.
Get off, bro!
Including Dominic Glass, who was handcuffed in the back of the car.
Bro, like, chill. What am I doing wrong? Hey, OP, get this on camera, you stupid bitch.
It's chaotic. People are clearly intoxicated.
Back up, bro. Take these cuffs off me, bro.
At this point, there are hundreds of kids standing around the vehicle, and it's 2 or 3 officers amongst a very large group of people. Everyone has their phone out, and as an officer, you always have to be aware of that person who may be trying to create that next viral moment.
And suddenly,
So we're watching this guy literally open a police car door to let the guy in the back escape, and he runs off.
police immediately run after him, but so does the crowd.
Now, at this point, it gets pretty chaotic. Everyone wants to be in on the viral moment, so he's running away while in handcuffs.
I don't really know what's going through their heads right now. I don't think they know. I think they're just thinking, oh, now this looks like a lot of fun, and not, oh, we're on a crime scene.
Now officers realize what has just transpired. They had someone who's in handcuffs, so not only was he being detained, but they are also responsible for his safety, so they need to get him under control as fast as possible.
The wild chase is captured from a variety of angles by many of the young onlookers.
So near the end of this clip, you can see that an officer is able to cut off the young gentleman that was in handcuffs. It seems that he deploys a taser. I really don't think that the young man realizes the type of trouble he's in.
Back up now! Back up! Congratulations. You're gonna get escaping charges.
What could have just been something where he was written up for fighting on the beach, maybe issued a citation, now he's looking at some serious charges. They put him back in the cruiser, and they make the right decision this time by pulling the cruiser away from the crowd.
And now the young escape artist is a tad winded.
Holy bro. What other information do you need to get me out of this car and give me some air, boss?
Within hours, the video is all over social media platforms and instantly goes viral.
Tonight we have this viral spring break moment.
The video is going viral on TikTok.
18-year-old Dominic Glass makes a run for it.
Glass is arrested. He pleads guilty to resisting an officer without violence and is ordered to pay a fine. But police also want to find his accomplice.
They're looking for the guy who helped him make this getaway in the first place.
It doesn't take long to identify him.
He posted online that he was the guy who opened the door, I think because he wanted some attention.
His name is Adam Assad.
Unfortunately for him, investigators also see his post.
The next day, police make a post of their own.
Adam really wanted attention from all of this, and the police did give him attention by tweeting out his mugshot, saying he's going to be famous for going to jail.
Assad is charged with obstructing an arrest without violence and aiding an escape. But after completing a court-ordered program for nonviolent offenses, his case is dismissed.
I think it's clear to say that the infamy or the celebrity that came with this, that momentary viral moment, wasn't worth what they had to go through, because although everyone was laughing and running with them at the time, they weren't the ones doing the community service with them, I can guarantee you that.
A terrifying close call shakes a family to their core.
Careened at nearly full speed.
Without even hitting his brakes.
My first thought was check the baby's room.
This was a bad situation.
Pega, 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 pega.
An attempt to apprehend a thief takes a dangerous turn.
When is the chaos going to stop?
Mom mentality is a thing.
All of this from stealing a phone.
A doorbell camera captures a disturbing nightmare unfolding in broad daylight.
Those flames were right outside his home.
This is terrifying.
Everyone should get a doorbell camera after this.
And a porch pirate in a pickle.
He's trying to peel out of there.
Your wheels are not spinning anywhere.
You're caught.
It is quite comical.
It's beached. It's not going anywhere.
Incredible crimes caught on camera. It's a bizarre incident that wreaks havoc on a quiet neighborhood.
Honestly thought it was like a dream, like what's actually happening right now.
It all begins around 4:30 in the morning. Jose and Brenna live with their 2 young kids on this suburban street.
So it's relatively quiet, and out of nowhere, we see a white pickup truck fly through that intersection without even hitting his brakes.
We had just come to bed, and all of a sudden we just heard this sound.
Driving through not only a tree, but a car, and also hitting the brick wall of this house.
And I immediately said, we have to go check the girls.
Inside, the couple's 2 daughters are sleeping.
So my first thought was check the baby's room. And we ran in there first, and she was okay.
Panicked, they race to their 12-year-old's room.
And she met us in the hall and said that this crash shook her whole room. She was so scared.
This was a bad situation, but it could have been a lot worse. If it wasn't for that small tree and that vehicle in the front yard, that truck would have driven directly into the bedroom of that small girl.
He was just barreling because we're like in the neighborhood, so it's 35 here. He must have gone like 55.
So at this point, the driver of the truck proceeds to try to back out of the yard, running back over the tree.
He was stuck on that tree for so long.
Yeah.
And at any point he could have stopped and gone, okay, I've done something wrong. I need to go make this right. And he didn't.
I was honestly going out there to make sure he was okay and not dead or something, but now he decided to just take off.
That's when he got on the cameras and checked the footage.
So from the footage, you actually have a pretty good shot of the driver. You can see that he's a heavy-set individual, and more importantly, he's wearing what appears to be some type of reflective vest.
I would assume somebody in a reflective jacket or vest is working in construction. It wouldn't be so far-fetched to imagine somebody who's working extremely long hours, maybe falling asleep, unfortunately, behind the wheel.
He doesn't appear to hit his brakes at all, so I would really want to know why that is.
We think he ran into the house because he was inebriated. There was no way that he didn't notice that he was about to hit a house without being under the influence of something.
He decides to leave the scene of the accident without checking to make sure that no one's injured or reporting it to the owners of the vehicle and the house. Now you have failure to stop, duty to stop, which would be a misdemeanor in most states.
The next day, the news is all over this wild story.
Police are trying to find the driver who, as you can see here, careened at nearly full speed into this house in North Lubbock today.
Who is this out-of-control driver? And where is he? After a car careens into a house in the middle of the night, then takes off, police are determined to find the driver.
Officers actually catch the driver later in the day when they respond to a domestic dispute, and as they arrive, they see the banged up truck in the front yard. There's tree branches, there's grass in the front grill.
The man is also wearing the same reflective vest as the man in the video. And after questioning, police have probable cause to suspect he was the driver. He is released pending charges. For Brenna and Jose, it turns out to be just one of that month's life-changing events.
One of the less crazy twists, but unfortunate twists for this couple is that the next week, they were getting married.
We were 9 days away from getting married in Las Vegas when this happened, and that was just not the stress that we needed at the time.
I mean, you already stressed as it was.
Yeah.
So anybody out there who has planned a wedding knows how stressful that is. Imagine having this catastrophic event on top of that.
But the wedding goes off without a hitch. And number one on these newlyweds' to-do list, some home upgrades.
We would really like to go to Target and steal those big red balls that they have out in front and put a few in front of the house just to be safe.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that the residents had video footage. More importantly, I'm glad that they had their vehicle parked in front of the house, because if it hadn't been there, this could have been a lot worse of a story.
And when people are angry, things can go from bad to worse in a hurry. This video of a criminal who refuses to go down without a fight is an epic viral hit.
I'm just like, when is the chaos going to stop?
It begins in a city just outside Rio de Janeiro, where a woman stands on a sidewalk lost in her phone.
She's so focused on the phone, she doesn't even notice the person on the bike right next to her.
For a moment, it looks like nothing.
We use our phones for everything. We probably have pictures of our ID. We have, our wallets with our credit card information. So when someone takes it, it's like they've taken a huge chunk of ourselves personally. So it is a really personal theft.
And then something shocking happens.
Just when you think, oh, it can't get more crazy, it gets crazier.
Wow, this guy just ran over someone for a phone. That's like pretty incredible. The bike is pinned under the vehicle. The suspect starts running.
Adrenaline has to be a factor here. He's up and he's running after getting hit by a car.
Now, a hot pursuit is underway. But why is the driver of the car joining in?
The guy in the vehicle jumps out and starts chasing after the phone thief.
I would think no phone is worth whatever is going to happen next, but he darts away.
The thief stumbles around the block, but just when he thinks he's dodged everybody,
almost out of thin air, we see this man kicking the guy in the head, like truly like he has a black belt in karate or something.
You have to imagine this guy has been waiting for this moment his entire life. I mean, how often do you get to do flying karate kicks in the air? Never.
If I was him, throw the phone on the ground, say I'm sorry, and hopefully have an escape route.
And now, a whole crowd of people has joined in to attack the phone thief.
Mob mentality is a thing. And, when one person starts hitting a criminal, it's a lot easier for other people to get involved. I don't know if this is some robber that has been in the neighborhood that people have been trying to capture for a while, or this is just a one-time occurrence, but they are going to pummel this guy until police arrive.
I'm freaking out right now watching him being surrounded because of all the intensity going on at this point. I really don't know how this is going to end. Is this a movie? Where is the special effects coming on? The worst possible scenario that could be happening right now is him dying over this phone.
When a mob descends on a man who stole a woman's phone, things start to spiral out of control. Luckily, police show up after a few minutes, and the 23-year-old suspect is treated at a hospital, then taken into custody.
The thief is charged with robbery. Local news reported that the suspect had a gun and it fell to the ground, but that somebody picked it up and took it away, so the gun was never recovered.
And there's a surprising twist. Remember that driver who rammed into the thief after he snatched the woman's phone?
Turns out we discover that is not just a random driver, it's her boyfriend who was arriving at the same time.
The video caught on local security cameras is posted all over the internet and racks up more than 9 million views. A lot of people on social media commend the woman's boyfriend for coming to her rescue.
The boyfriend has to feel like he's the hero in the situation. But why was he so scared about his girlfriend's phone being stolen? Was there something on that phone he didn't want other people to see?
Whatever the boyfriend's motive was, this criminal should consider himself lucky.
This could have possibly turned into a much more deadly situation. If the mob had decided that they wanted to have street justice, they could have ended his life.
I don't think he even was realizing all of this was gonna happen from stealing a phone.
Other crooks seem to forget that there are cameras everywhere. This is a bold arson, recorded from the moment it begins.
I mean, everyone should get a doorbell camera after this.
Almost everyone has a doorbell camera these days. Sometimes they capture life's funniest moments. But in this case, we see horror unfolding in real time.
A white guy in a hoodie comes up to the doorbell. He's trying to hide himself, and then he sort of gives up, and then he just starts spraying liquid all over the camera and all over the house, and then lights it on fire.
What this suspect may possibly have thought is that if he burns the camera or puts, something on it or something along those lines, that the video won't pick up everything. But what he doesn't realize is if you have one of these cameras at home, it's like a live feed.
William Sanders, the homeowner, is at a friend's house having dinner, and he gets an alert from his doorbell camera, sees this guy, and sees his house being set on fire.
As he watches in shock, he feels helpless. But he's miles away. All he can do is call the fire department.
This is a terrifying situation for this homeowner.
The first thing he has to be thinking is, all of my possessions, all of my memories are about to be lost. Luckily, the neighbors actually come over and they start hosing off the house. Then the fire department eventually comes, but they were able to salvage the house.
The homeowner has no idea who this man is or why he would do this. So he turns to the local media for help.
It's thanks to this doorbell camera that he saw those flames were right outside his home, and a complete stranger was the one who set fire.
Personal opinion is they got the wrong house. They should have been somewhere else.
You've never seen this guy
I've not seen this gentleman before.
You don't have beef with anybody?
No.
Police released the image of the mysterious arsonist to the public.
People came forward. They were able to identify the person in this video.
And when police show up to apprehend him, he's actually wearing the same shirt that he was the day that he set fire to Williams' house.
36-year-old Justin Winjum is charged with arson and criminal damage.
Doorbell cameras can be a fantastic resource and can also help investigators in many crimes.
And in Williams' case, that camera prevented what could have been a complete tragedy.
Williams' front porch could be replaced. Thankfully, he still has all of his memories inside of his house. And that day, no one was injured. That's the best news of all.
Another porch crime in Canada turns into a nightmare for the would-be thief.
Yeah, it's done. You're done.
Call police, now!
Porch pirates, thieves who steal your packages right off your front doorstep, are becoming a persistent nuisance.
You're done.
It's happening in every neighborhood all over North America.
A would-be porch pirate is facing charges.
You're done. Cops is coming.
I hate it when this happens, when you got a small car, Mr. B-Town.
Oh, let's go into the snowbank.
4 days into the new year, a couple just outside Toronto wakes up to the sound of someone at their door. The startled porch pirate bolts to his getaway car.
You're done. Cops is coming. Cops is coming.
Quick, call the police, now!
You call?
I'm calling.
The wife is so frazzled by the situation.
It's going to your number. I don't know the number.
She's like, I need to call the police, but what's the number to police?
You're done.
It's literally a train wreck of a car getaway.
Look, Dan, your wheels are not spinning anywhere.
You're caught!
The wheels of the car are going full force, but nothing is happening.
It's only 7 seconds from the time he's busted to the time he gets to his car. But it seems like he is stuck on this snowbank for eternity.
Want me to get you a shovel?
While the wife is running around trying to figure out the number and call police, the husband actually offers the porch pirate a shovel.
I get you a shovel.
This is the most stereotypical Canadian crime of all time because you have the person who's the victim trying to help the criminal out. You don't see that here in America.
He's trying to dig and dig the snow away from his wheels, but the wheels aren't even touching the ground.
It's front wheel drive. You need to get the wheels on the ground.
I'm getting an extreme sense of secondhand embarrassment from this video.
The wheel is not even on the ground. You need to get the wheel on the ground.
It's almost to the point where I want to turn it off, but I also have to keep watching to see if he can get off of the snowbank.
The police are coming. Just forget it. Okay, well.
I think he is sincerely sorry that he decided to be a porch pirate this day.
Your wheels are not spinning anywhere.
You're caught! No mercy.
It seems like the husband has really calmed down. The entire time the wife is really angry.
You ass!
She just wants this guy to get arrested.
After 6 minutes of futile tire spinning, police arrive.
When the police do show up, the suspect is sitting in his car.
Seriously, he's gonna take a sip of water right now?
And he actually takes a sip of water, which enrages the wife even more.
Hands up. Get out of the car now!
Once the homeowner's cell phone footage hits the internet, it's a viral hit with millions of views. For newscasters, it's a struggle to maintain composure.
He's trying to peel out of there and front-wheel drive car, it's beached. It's not going anywhere.
The homeowner, well, they've already called 911 by now. Now all they can do is sit back and watch the show.
He was stuck in a bit of a pickle there, like literally.
At a press conference, even the police can't stifle their laughter.
Once they get there, sure enough, that individual's still struggling with that vehicle.
It is quite comical. Just watching the car after he jumps in, tries to reverse out, gets stuck on the snow, and the wheels are just turning.
I feel if we didn't have the police coming to arrest this guy, we would have seen the entire neighborhood get together to help this man get his car off the snow.
On social media, the hapless thief takes a beating.
Anyone who lives in Canada should definitely know how to maneuver a snowbank.
Ultimately, this porch pirate is arrested for theft. Can't imagine the police not laughing at him the entire way to the station.
The 33-year-old porch pirate is charged with fraud and theft under $5,000.
If I was this porch pirate, I would have just stayed home or waited for spring.
And there's a lesson here for all homeowners.
I feel my advice for anybody who owns a home and doesn't want a porch pirate is to know when your packages are arriving or just go to the store.
Get down the car now!
Carl Eugene Watts was never supposed to become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. At least, not according to the justice system. Officially, the record is remarkably brief. 2 murder convictions. Yet behind those 2 convictions lies a number that has haunted investigators, prosecutors, and victims' families for decades. 13 murders confessed. Between 80 and 90 victims suspected by investigators. Some detectives believe the true number could have exceeded 100. If even part of those estimates is accurate, Watts would rank among the deadliest serial killers the United States has ever known. And yet for years, he walked freely through neighborhoods, attended college classes, held ordinary jobs, drove familiar streets, and blended into crowds without attracting more than passing attention. His story is not simply the story of one killer. It is the story of an era when forensic science was still developing, when police departments rarely shared information across state lines, and when patterns that seem obvious today remained hidden behind stacks of paper files stored in separate jurisdictions. It is also a story that belongs first and foremost to dozens of women whose lives ended suddenly, often just steps from the safety of their own homes. Long before Carl Eugene Watts became known as the Sunday morning slasher, there were only unexplained murders. Women attacked while unlocking apartment doors. Women assaulted in parking lots. Women who disappeared into the ordinary routines of daily life and never returned. At first, each crime looked isolated. Different neighborhoods, different weapons, different victims. Some were stabbed repeatedly. Others were strangled. Some drowned. In another era, investigators might have searched immediately for a single offender. But during the 1970s, linking crimes across cities, and especially across state borders, was an enormous challenge. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Digital databases had not yet transformed criminal investigations. Detectives relied on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, physical evidence, and instinct. When those pieces failed to fit together, cases often remained unsolved. Against that backdrop, Carl Eugene Watts moved almost invisibly. Born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, his early life gave little indication of the fear his name would one day inspire. His parents divorced while he was still young, and afterward his mother moved with him to Michigan, where he spent most of his childhood. Those who knew him later described a quiet, withdrawn young man rather than someone openly violent. Family members recalled that around the age of 8 or 9, after suffering from meningitis, his personality appeared to change. They remembered a child who became increasingly distant, spoke less than before, and sometimes made unsettling comments about women's evil eyes. Whether those observations reflected the effects of illness, emotional struggles, or something else entirely remains uncertain. What is known is that these memories later became part of investigators' attempts to understand how someone could live an outwardly unremarkable life while allegedly committing repeated acts of extraordinary violence. Watts was physically imposing, standing approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall. During high school, he played football and possessed the strength and athletic build that allowed him to appear confident despite his reserved personality. Psychological testing later placed his IQ at around 75. Below average, but still well within the range that allowed him to function independently, attend college, and hold employment. Experts suggested that he displayed characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder and possible paranoid thinking. But he was repeatedly found competent to stand trial and legally responsible for his actions. These clinical observations may help explain certain aspects of his behavior, but they do not explain the devastation left behind by the crimes investigators believe he committed. Those crimes, and the victims who suffered because of them, remain the central focus of this story. In 1972, Watts enrolled at Western Michigan University. To classmates, he seemed almost forgettable. He was quiet, polite, and largely kept to himself. He was not known for causing disturbances or attracting disciplinary attention. There were no dramatic confrontations that caused fellow students to fear him. If anything, he blended into campus life so completely that many people barely remembered him years later when his name dominated newspaper headlines. That anonymity would become one of his greatest advantages. Few people suspect danger from someone who appears ordinary. Even fewer imagine that a reserved classmate might be living a hidden life beyond the classroom. Looking back, investigators found no obvious trail of escalating public violence before the murders began. There were no notorious assaults that clearly predicted what was to come. There were no spectacular warning signs that forced authorities to intervene. Instead, there was silence. And sometimes, silence is exactly what allows predators to operate undetected. The murder that investigators later connected to Watts occurred in September 1974. Gloria Steele was 19 years old. She had returned to her apartment and was attempting to unlock her door when she was attacked. According to the available evidence, the assailant strangled her before stabbing her more than 30 times. There was no indication that she had been sexually assaulted. Nothing suggested robbery as a motive. Her belongings remained. The violence appeared sudden, overwhelming, and deeply personal despite the apparent absence of any known relationship between victim and attacker. At the time, investigators treated the homicide as an isolated crime, without eyewitnesses or sufficient physical evidence pointing toward a suspect. The case remained unsolved. Years would pass before new evidence and witness testimony eventually connected Carl Eugene Watts to Gloria Steele's death, leading to one of only 2 murder convictions secured against him. That first known killing also revealed something investigators would later recognize as a recurring pattern. Watts did not appear motivated by money. He did not consistently seek sexual assault. Instead, according to investigators, the violence itself seemed to be the objective. His attacks were typically swift. He selected women who were alone. He struck near apartment entrances or parking areas, places where victims naturally believed they were only seconds away from safety. The assaults often lasted less than a minute. Then he disappeared, leaving behind confusion rather than clear investigative leads. Such crimes were especially difficult to solve during an era before widespread surveillance cameras and advanced forensic science. Every unsolved case became another file placed on another detective's desk, often without anyone realizing it resembled cases unfolding elsewhere. Throughout the latter half of the 1970s, the number of unexplained attacks on women began to grow. Yet because methods sometimes differed, stabbing in one case, strangulation in another, drowning in yet another, the connection between them remained uncertain. Modern discussions of serial killers often emphasize ritual or signature behaviors. But Carl Eugene Watts challenged many traditional assumptions. Investigators believed he used whatever methods circumstances allowed. The common thread was not the weapon. It was the victim. Young women, frequently alone, attacked quickly and unexpectedly before the offender vanished almost as suddenly as he had appeared. This apparent lack of consistency complicated every effort to identify him. Detectives searching for a killer who always used a knife might overlook cases involving drowning. Officers investigating a strangulation might never compare notes with colleagues examining a stabbing. The absence of one clearly recognizable signature may have contributed significantly to the years during which Watts remained free. Newspapers eventually gave the unknown offender a name that reflected one noticeable trend. Several attacks occurred on Sunday mornings around the Ann Arbor area of Michigan, prompting journalists to refer to the unidentified suspect as the Sunday morning slasher. It was a dramatic nickname, one that captured public attention, but it also risked oversimplifying a much broader series of crimes. Not every attack occurred on a Sunday. Not every victim died from stab wounds. The nickname endured nevertheless, becoming permanently linked to the man investigators increasingly believed was responsible. By then, fear had begun spreading through neighborhoods where women questioned whether simply walking from a parking lot to an apartment door could become a fatal journey. But despite growing concern and mounting similarities between cases, authorities still lacked the decisive evidence necessary to stop the man they suspected. As the years passed, Carl Eugene Watts remained outside prison walls. He continued living what appeared to be an ordinary life, while investigators struggled to prove what many increasingly believed to be true. The distance between suspicion and conviction would define the next chapter of this extraordinary and deeply tragic case. When investigators later attempted to reconstruct the life of Carl Eugene Watts, they were confronted with a frustrating reality. Unlike many notorious serial killers whose childhoods were marked by documented violence, repeated arrests, or obvious warning signs, Watts left behind a far quieter history. His early years contained moments that relatives and acquaintances would later describe as unusual, but none that clearly predicted the trail of violence investigators believed would eventually span multiple states. The absence of dramatic warning signs became one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. It challenged the comforting assumption that extraordinary crimes must always be preceded by extraordinary behavior. Born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, Carl Eugene Watts entered a family that would not remain together for long. After his parents divorced, his mother moved with him to Inkster, Michigan, where he spent much of his childhood. The transition from Texas to Michigan represented more than a change in geography. It marked the beginning of a life that, from the outside, appeared remarkably ordinary. There were no headlines announcing a troubled child, no school records describing escalating violence, no criminal history that drew the attention of local authorities. For years, Carl Eugene Watts was simply another boy growing up in suburban Michigan. Yet those closest to him later recalled a period during childhood that seemed to change him in subtle but significant ways. Around the age of 8 or 9, Watts contracted meningitis, a serious illness affecting the protective membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord. He recovered physically, but family members would later insist that something about his personality had shifted afterward. According to their recollections, he became noticeably quieter than before. Conversations grew shorter. Social interaction became increasingly limited. The outgoing child they remembered seemed to withdraw into himself. Relatives also recalled comments that, in hindsight, felt deeply unsettling. Watts reportedly spoke about the evil eyes of women and sometimes appeared intensely uncomfortable when looking at them. Some remembered him staring for unusually long periods, while others described episodes in which he seemed unable to explain why certain women made him feel threatened or angry. Investigators documented these observations because they appeared repeatedly during interviews with people who had known him as a child. However, it is important to recognize that these memories were gathered years after his arrest, when every unusual childhood behavior naturally carried greater significance than it had at the time. There is no evidence that these comments prompted medical intervention or criminal concern during his youth. They remained, instead, troubling recollections viewed through the lens of what would later unfold. As Watts grew older, his reserved nature became even more apparent. Friends were few. He rarely participated in social activities beyond what was necessary. Dating was uncommon, and classmates generally remembered him as someone who kept to himself. Despite this isolation, he was physically impressive, standing approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall and possessing the strength developed through playing high school football. Watts presented an image of quiet athleticism rather than intimidation. Teachers and classmates did not describe him as openly aggressive or disruptive. Instead, he blended into the background, avoiding attention whenever possible. Psychological testing conducted later in life estimated his IQ at approximately 75. Although below average, this level of intellectual functioning did not prevent him from living independently or pursuing higher education. He remained capable of understanding the consequences of his actions, a conclusion that would later become significant when mental health professionals evaluated his competency to stand trial. Some experts suggested he displayed traits associated with antisocial personality disorder combined with paranoid thinking. Yet they consistently concluded that he understood right from wrong and could be held legally responsible for his behavior. These evaluations sought to explain aspects of his personality, but they did not excuse the crimes investigators attributed to him. In 1972, Watts enrolled at Western Michigan University. Once again, he disappeared into ordinary life. Fellow students remembered a young man who was polite, soft-spoken, and almost invisible. He attended classes, interacted minimally with others, and rarely attracted notice. Years later, when detectives interviewed former classmates after his arrest, many struggled to recall anything memorable about him. Some remembered seeing him on campus but could offer little beyond that. Others admitted they would never have associated the quiet student they once passed in hallways with. The man accused of multiple murders. This ability to avoid attention would become one of Watts' defining characteristics. Unlike offenders who inserted themselves into investigations or sought publicity, Watts appeared content to remain unnoticed. His anonymity shielded him in ways that investigators would only fully appreciate after years of unsolved cases. At the same time, there were no documented incidents suggesting an escalating pattern of public violence before the murders began. He accumulated no notorious criminal record that might have placed him under closer scrutiny. There were no highly public confrontations that convinced authorities he posed a danger. Whatever thoughts or impulses existed remained largely hidden from those around him. Investigators would later remark that this absence of obvious warning signs complicated efforts to understand how someone could transition from an apparently quiet college student to a suspected serial killer. The answer, if one exists, was never fully uncovered. Then came September 1974, the event many investigators considered the beginning of the known sequence of killings. Gloria Steele was 19 years old when she returned to her apartment one evening. Like countless young adults, she was carrying out an ordinary routine, expecting to be safe once she reached her front door. According to investigators, that sense of security vanished in seconds. As she attempted to unlock the apartment, an attacker struck. Evidence indicated that Gloria was first strangled before being stabbed more than 30 times. The sheer number of stab wounds reflected extreme violence. Yet investigators found no evidence suggesting robbery. Her belongings remained untouched. There was also no indication of sexual assault. The absence of these common motives immediately distinguished the homicide from many other violent crimes. Detectives searched for explanations. Had Gloria known her attacker? Was this a crime of passion? Had she interrupted a burglary? None of those possibilities fit comfortably with the available evidence. Without eyewitnesses and lacking sufficient forensic evidence to identify a suspect, the investigation gradually stalled. At the time, the murder appeared to be an isolated tragedy rather than the opening chapter of a much larger investigation. Years later, as authorities revisited unsolved cases connected to Carl Eugene Watts, new evidence and witness testimony would eventually link him to Gloria Steele's murder, resulting in one of only 2 homicide convictions obtained against him. Looking back, Investigators recognized that Gloria Steele's death established several characteristics that would appear repeatedly in later cases. The attack occurred suddenly. The victim was alone. The assault happened close to the entrance of her residence, a place where she naturally believed safety was only moments away. The violence was overwhelming, but neither theft nor sexual assault appeared to motivate the crime. Instead, investigators concluded that the killing itself seemed to be the objective. This pattern would become increasingly familiar as additional women were attacked in the years that followed. What made these crimes especially difficult to investigate was the apparent lack of a fixed method. Many serial offenders rely on consistent techniques or rituals that allow detectives to recognize linked cases. Watts, however, appeared far less predictable. According to investigators, he sometimes strangled victims, sometimes stabbed them, sometimes used a screwdriver, sometimes employed blunt force, and in other cases drowned victims in bathtubs or pools. At first glance, these differences suggested unrelated offenders. Only over time did investigators begin to recognize that the similarities lay elsewhere. The victims were overwhelmingly women, generally between 18 and 40 years old. Many were attacked alone while approaching or entering apartments. The assaults unfolded with startling speed, often lasting only moments before the attacker disappeared. This combination of rapid violence and inconsistent methods complicated efforts to establish a clear investigative profile. The killers seemed to adapt to opportunity rather than following a rigid ritual. That flexibility may have contributed significantly to his ability to avoid arrest during the early years of the investigation. By the late 1970s, authorities in Michigan were beginning to notice recurring similarities among a growing number of unsolved attacks on women. Newspapers searching for a way to describe the unknown offender observed that several assaults had occurred on Sunday mornings around the Ann Arbor area. The media introduced a name that would endure long after the identity of the suspect became known: the Sunday morning slasher. Although not every attack took place on a Sunday, and not every victim died from stab wounds, the nickname captured the public's imagination and reflected the growing fear spreading through affected communities. Women altered routines, became more cautious when returning home alone, and questioned whether the familiar walk from a parking lot to an apartment entrance could suddenly become a deadly encounter. Yet despite rising concern and increasing suspicion that a single offender might be responsible, investigators still lacked the evidence necessary to bring charges. Carl Eugene Watts remained free, living an outwardly ordinary life while the list of unsolved cases continued to grow, setting the stage for the next and increasingly alarming phase of the investigation. By the late 1970s, investigators in Michigan were beginning to confront a possibility that no police department welcomes. Individual homicide cases, each tragic on its own, were slowly revealing patterns that suggested they might not be isolated at all. A woman attacked while returning home. Another assaulted only steps from her apartment. Another found stabbed without any apparent motive of robbery or sexual assault. None of the cases alone proved the existence of a serial offender, but together they raised difficult questions. If these murders were connected, then the person responsible had already spent years moving unnoticed through ordinary neighborhoods, selecting victims at random and disappearing before anyone could stop him. The challenge facing investigators was that the similarities were subtle rather than obvious. The murder weapons varied. Some victims were strangled before being stabbed. Others suffered different forms of fatal violence. Traditional assumptions about serial offenders often relied upon a recognizable pattern, a consistent weapon, a ritual, or a signature left at every crime scene. Carl Eugene Watts appeared to offer none of those certainties. According to investigators, he adapted his methods to circumstances, making it far more difficult to recognize that multiple cases might belong to the same offender. Yet beneath those differences lay a disturbing consistency. The victims were overwhelmingly women. Most were between 18 and 40 years old. They were alone when attacked. Many were assaulted near apartment entrances or parking lots, locations where they believed safety was only moments away. The attacks unfolded with remarkable speed. There was little evidence of prolonged confrontation. Robbery almost never appeared to be the objective. Sexual assault was generally absent. The violence itself seemed to be the purpose. Detectives reviewing unsolved files noticed that these women had not been targeted because of wealth, profession, or personal relationships. They appeared to have been selected simply because they happened to cross paths with the offender at the wrong moment. Investigators later concluded that Watts often chose victims opportunistically rather than through lengthy planning. According to the investigative findings, his method of selection was alarmingly simple. He drove through residential neighborhoods searching for women who were alone. If he saw someone walking toward an apartment or approaching a building entrance without companions nearby, he sometimes acted immediately. There was no evidence that he routinely followed victims for days or conducted elaborate surveillance. Instead, the decision to attack could occur within moments. He would stop his vehicle, approach quickly, launch an overwhelming assault, and leave almost as rapidly as he had arrived. This spontaneity deprived investigators of many of the clues commonly found in cases involving prolonged stalking. The victims often had no opportunity to recognize danger before the attack began. The locations themselves worked in the killer's favor. Apartment complexes naturally brought strangers together. Residents came and went throughout the day. Visitors entered without attracting attention. And parking lots were filled with unfamiliar vehicles. A person standing near an apartment entrance rarely appeared suspicious. Someone walking across a parking lot could easily blend into the normal flow of daily activity. By exploiting these ordinary environments, the offender minimized the likelihood that witnesses would immediately recognize criminal behavior. Even if someone glimpsed a tall man leaving the area, they might simply assume he was another resident returning home. Among the victims whose names would later become associated with the Michigan investigation were Jean Klein, Shirley Small, Glenda Richmond, Rebecca Huff, and Helen Dutcher. Although each case possessed its own individual circumstances, investigators identified common characteristics consistent with the developing pattern. Jean Klein was attacked near her apartment and stabbed multiple times. There was no indication that robbery motivated the crime. Shirley Small was killed near her residence, and investigators found little evidence of an extended struggle. Glenda Richmond was attacked while walking alone, and the assailant fled immediately after the assault. Rebecca Huff was strangled and stabbed, yet once again investigators found that no property had been taken. Each case deepened the concern that the community faced not a series of unrelated tragedies but a single offender capable of striking repeatedly while leaving little evidence behind. Then came the murder of Helen Dutcher, a case that would eventually become one of the most significant in the entire investigation. On August 26, 1979, Helen returned to her apartment, expecting what countless people expect every day, that once she reached her own front door, she would be safe. According to investigators, a man suddenly approached and launched a violent attack. Helen suffered numerous stab wounds and died from her injuries. At the time, despite the growing similarities to previous cases, investigators still lacked the evidence necessary to identify and prosecute the offender. However, one detail from that day would prove invaluable decades later. A neighbor named Joseph Foy observed a man leaving the area shortly after the attack. At the time, his observations alone were insufficient to secure an arrest. Yet memories preserved through witness statements sometimes gain new significance when additional evidence emerges. Years later, Joseph Foy identified Carl Eugene Watts as the man he had seen near Helen Dutcher's apartment. That identification would become a critical component of the prosecution that eventually secured a life sentence against Watts in 2004. But in 1979, that breakthrough still lay many years in the future. During the original investigation, detectives were left with fragments rather than certainty. As the number of similar attacks increased, public anxiety spread throughout Michigan communities. Newspapers reported on the unexplained violence with growing frequency. Residents who once considered apartment complexes relatively secure began changing their routines. Women avoided walking alone whenever possible. Friends accompanied one another to parking lots. Apartment doors were locked more carefully than before. Conversations increasingly centered on the unknown man whom newspapers had begun calling the Sunday Morning Slasher. The nickname emerged because several attacks occurred on Sunday mornings around the Ann Arbor area. While the label captured public attention, investigators understood that it represented only part of the broader picture. Not every attack happened on a Sunday, and stabbing was not always the method used. Nevertheless, the name reflected the fear gripping communities searching desperately for answers. Detectives intensified their efforts to determine whether one individual truly linked the cases. Witness descriptions began drawing attention to a possible suspect. Several accounts described a tall black male seen near crime scenes. Although such descriptions remained too general to establish probable cause, they provided investigators with a starting point. Among those who came under increasing scrutiny was Carl Eugene Watts. Standing approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall, Watts physically matched aspects of several witness descriptions. More importantly, investigators gradually noticed that his movements and circumstances appeared worthy of closer examination. They began monitoring him more carefully. According to the available information, detectives documented his vehicle, recorded license plate information, interviewed him repeatedly, and even attached a tracking device to his vehicle in accordance with the legal procedures available at the time. These investigative measures reflected a growing belief that Watts might be connected to the expanding series of unsolved murders. Yet suspicion alone could not support criminal charges. The late 1970s presented enormous limitations for homicide investigators. DNA profiling had not yet become available. Surveillance cameras were rare. Mobile phone records did not exist. Many crime scenes yielded little usable physical evidence because attacks occurred outdoors or lasted only seconds. Witnesses often saw only fleeting glimpses of someone leaving the area, making positive identification extraordinarily difficult. Even as detectives focused increasing attention on Carl Eugene Watts, they lacked the decisive forensic evidence required to place him at specific murder scenes beyond reasonable doubt. Every unanswered question allowed the investigation to continue without resolution. For investigators, the frustration was profound. They believed they were close to identifying the person responsible, yet each attempt to build a prosecutable case fell short. Interviews failed to produce confessions. Physical evidence remained inconclusive. Circumstantial suspicions accumulated but never crossed the threshold required by the courts. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. Unknown to many outside the investigation, Carl Eugene Watts had begun recognizing that police attention was turning toward him. Whether through repeated interviews, surveillance, or simply an awareness that investigators had become increasingly interested in his activities, he appeared to understand that remaining in Michigan might eventually place him at greater risk. Rather than waiting for authorities to assemble stronger evidence, Watts made a decision that would dramatically complicate the investigation. He left Michigan and relocated to Houston, Texas. For local detectives, the move represented both a setback and a warning. Without a conviction or sufficient evidence to detain him, there was little they could do to prevent his departure. More troubling still, police departments in different states during that era often lacked the integrated communication systems that exist today. Information traveled slowly, records were maintained separately, and identifying patterns across jurisdictions required extraordinary effort. As Carl Eugene Watts settled into a new city hundreds of miles away, investigators in Michigan could only hope that their suspicions had been wrong. Instead, according to investigators, the violence was about to begin again in another state. where a new series of victims would unknowingly encounter the same elusive predator who had already left behind years of unanswered questions in Michigan. When Carl Eugene Watts left Michigan for Houston, Texas, he also left behind a growing collection of unanswered homicide investigations. For detectives in Michigan, his departure meant that the man they increasingly suspected was no longer within their immediate reach. Yet because they had never obtained sufficient evidence to prosecute him, there was no legal mechanism preventing him from beginning a new life elsewhere. In the early 1980s, moving from one state to another could effectively place hundreds of miles between investigators and a suspect, especially in cases lacking definitive forensic proof. Police departments maintained separate records. Communication between jurisdictions was slower than it is today, and the absence of integrated criminal databases often meant that investigators had only fragments of a much larger picture. As Watts established himself in Houston, authorities there had no reason to view him as one of the primary suspects in a string of unsolved Michigan murders. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared to be another ordinary resident adapting to a new city. Meanwhile, investigators in Michigan remained burdened by cases that continued to resist resolution. It would take years before those separate investigations could be viewed together as parts of a single narrative. According to investigators, however, the violence did not remain behind in Michigan. Soon after arriving in Texas, a series of attacks on women began to display troubling similarities to the crimes that had alarmed communities hundreds of miles away. Again, women were attacked near their homes or inside their apartments. Again, robbery did not appear to be the motive. Again, investigators struggled to understand why victims who had no apparent connection to one another were being targeted with sudden, overwhelming violence. Although each crime possessed its own circumstances, detectives would later recognize familiar patterns emerging beneath the surface. Among the women whose names became associated with the Texas investigations were Linda Tilley, Elizabeth Montgomery, Susan Wolf, Michelle Mayday, Emily Lakua, and Edith Ledette. Each represents an individual life interrupted by violence, and each became part of the broader effort to understand the movements and alleged crimes of Carl Eugene Watts. Available information indicates that several of these women were attacked inside or immediately outside their residences. Some were stabbed, others were drowned in bathtubs. The methods continued to vary, reinforcing the challenge investigators had already encountered in Michigan. If detectives searched only for one weapon or one precise pattern of injury, they risked overlooking important connections. Yet when the cases were examined together, certain consistencies remained impossible to ignore. The victims were overwhelmingly women. They were frequently alone. The attacks happened quickly, often before anyone nearby recognized that a crime was taking place. Property generally remained untouched, suggesting that financial gain played little or no role. Likewise, investigators consistently found little evidence indicating that sexual assault had motivated the killings. Instead, as in Michigan, the violence itself appeared to be the central objective. This apparent absence of conventional motives made the crimes especially difficult to interpret. Detectives routinely investigate homicide by asking who benefits from the victim's death. Was there a financial dispute? A domestic conflict? A personal grudge? In the cases associated with Watts, those familiar explanations repeatedly failed to fit the evidence. The victims often had no known relationship with their attacker. They had not been selected because of wealth or occupation. According to investigators, many appeared simply to have crossed paths with the wrong individual at the wrong moment. That randomness intensified public fear because it suggested that almost any woman walking alone could become the next victim. Investigators also concluded that Watts did not appear to spend long periods stalking specific individuals. Instead, he allegedly selected victims opportunistically: a woman returning home, someone walking from a parking area toward an apartment, someone entering a residence alone. These ordinary moments, repeated every day in countless neighborhoods, became opportunities for sudden violence. The attacks unfolded with remarkable speed, leaving victims little chance to defend themselves or attract assistance before the offender disappeared. The brevity of these encounters created another obstacle for investigators. Witnesses rarely observed the beginning of an assault. By the time someone heard a disturbance or noticed unusual activity, the attacker had often fled. Even when witnesses reported seeing a man leaving the area, those observations frequently consisted of only a few seconds. Such brief encounters made reliable identification extremely difficult, particularly in an era without widespread security cameras. The investigation, therefore, depended heavily upon physical evidence, eyewitness recollections, and painstaking comparisons between separate crime scenes. Unfortunately, many scenes yielded only limited forensic material. The technological limitations of the period continued to favor an offender who acted quickly and left little behind. As investigators struggled with individual homicide cases in Texas, another problem persisted beneath the surface. Authorities there were not yet fully aware of the similarities linking their investigations to unsolved murders in Michigan. Today, digital systems allow detectives to compare cases across jurisdictions with far greater efficiency. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, however, that process depended upon direct communication, manual record sharing, and the initiative of individual investigators. As a result, valuable connections could remain hidden for years. Watts benefited from that fragmentation. Whether intentionally or simply by circumstance, his relocation complicated every effort to recognize the full extent of the alleged pattern. Meanwhile, the fear experienced by communities in Texas began to resemble what residents of Michigan had already endured. Women became increasingly cautious when returning home alone. Apartment complexes that once represented routine residential spaces acquired an atmosphere of uncertainty. Every unfamiliar face in a parking lot attracted greater attention. Every unexpected sound outside an apartment door caused anxiety. Families urged daughters, sisters, and friends not to walk alone whenever possible. The psychological impact of repeated unsolved attacks extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire neighborhoods adjusted their daily routines in response to a threat they could neither identify nor predict. Yet despite mounting concern, authorities still lacked the decisive breakthrough needed to stop the person they suspected. The murders associated with Watts demonstrated why serial homicide investigations often become so complex when offenders avoid predictable routines. Traditional investigative models rely upon repeated behaviors that reveal a consistent signature. Watts appeared different. According to investigators, he was willing to alter the method of killing depending upon opportunity. Strangulation in one case, stabbing in another, drowning when circumstances allowed. Rather than weakening the investigative theory, these differences ultimately reinforced a broader conclusion. The common element was not the weapon, but the offender's apparent willingness to exploit whatever circumstances presented themselves. This flexibility allowed him to attack in varied environments while leaving detectives searching for connections that were less immediately obvious. Among the victims linked to the Texas investigation, Michelle Mayday would eventually become particularly significant, although her name would later become closely associated with the events leading to Watts' arrest. At this stage, investigators knew only that another woman had lost her life under circumstances resembling previous unexplained attacks. Her death, like those of Linda Tilley, Elizabeth Montgomery, Susan Wolf, Emily Lakwa, and Edith Ledet, added urgency to an investigation that still lacked a clear resolution. Detectives understood that each unsolved homicide increased the possibility that the offender would strike again. Every day, without an arrest, represented another day during which an unknown individual remained free. Throughout this period, Carl Eugene Watts continued to avoid prosecution for homicide. Suspicion, even when strong, could not replace evidence capable of satisfying legal standards in court. Investigators believed they were confronting an exceptionally dangerous offender. Yet belief alone could not justify an arrest. This gap between investigative suspicion and prosecutable proof became one of the defining characteristics of the case. It illustrated the enormous burden carried by homicide detectives who must transform fragmented observations into evidence strong enough to withstand judicial scrutiny. Eventually, however, circumstances would change, not because years of unsolved murders suddenly produced decisive forensic evidence, but because one intended victim survived long enough to disrupt the sequence that had protected the offender for so many years. On the morning of May 23, 1982, an attack inside a Houston apartment would unfold differently from those that had come before. The decisions made by two young women during those terrifying moments would interrupt a pattern of violence that investigators believed had continued for nearly 8 years. For the first time, Carl Eugene Watts would no longer disappear quietly into another neighborhood after an attack. Instead, events already set in motion would place him face to face with responding police officers, marking the beginning of the final chapter of his years as a free man. The morning of May 23, 1982, began like countless other mornings in Houston. Residents left apartments for work, neighbors moved quietly through hallways, and nothing about the day suggested that it would become one of the most significant moments in the investigation into Carl Eugene Watts. For years, investigators believed they had been pursuing a man who appeared without warning, attacked with overwhelming speed, and disappeared before anyone could identify him. The pattern had repeated itself across Michigan and Texas, leaving behind grieving families, frightened communities, and detectives burdened by an ever-growing collection of unsolved cases. Yet unlike so many of the attacks that preceded it, the events of this day would not end with another unexplained crime scene and another elusive escape. This time, the sequence of events changed because two women refused, in different ways, to surrender completely to the violence unfolding around them. According to investigators, Carl Eugene Watts encountered Lori Lister on the morning of May 23rd and followed her back to her apartment. As in many of the attacks later attributed to him, the setting itself appeared entirely ordinary. Apartment complexes had long figured prominently in the investigation because they offered both opportunity and anonymity. Residents regularly entered and exited buildings without questioning unfamiliar faces nearby. Visitors came and went throughout the day. A stranger standing in a parking lot or walking through common areas often attracted little attention. Investigators believed Watts had repeatedly taken advantage of precisely this kind of environment, approaching women only moments before they reached what they believed was the safety of their own homes. Lori Lister had no reason to expect that returning to her apartment would place her in immediate danger. According to investigators, Watts suddenly attacked her, overpowering her before she could escape. He strangled her and forced her inside the apartment. The assault unfolded rapidly, consistent with the swift attacks that investigators had observed in numerous earlier cases. Once inside, however, the situation became even more dangerous because Lori was not alone in the apartment. Her roommate, Melinda Aguilar, was also present. Instead of fleeing after confronting an unexpected witness, investigators stated that Watts turned his attention toward Melinda as well. He attacked her, subdued both women, and restrained them. By this point, the crime had evolved far beyond the brief outdoor assaults that characterized many previous cases. Investigators believed Watts intended to continue the attack inside the apartment, where he would be shielded from immediate public view. According to the available evidence, he prepared to drown the women in the bathtub, a method investigators had already associated with several earlier killings. The confined setting of the apartment dramatically reduced the victim's chances of attracting outside assistance. Doors and walls separated them from neighboring residents. Unless someone heard unmistakable signs of distress, help might never arrive in time. The situation appeared almost hopeless. Yet in the midst of those terrifying circumstances, Melinda Aguilar made a decision that would ultimately alter the course of the investigation. According to investigators, she pretended to lose consciousness. Whether driven by instinct, remarkable composure under extreme pressure, or simple desperation, the strategy convinced Watts that she no longer posed an immediate threat. Believing both women to be under his control, he briefly shifted his attention elsewhere inside the apartment. Investigators stated that Watts left the immediate area for several moments to prepare the bathtub. By running water, those few seconds created an opportunity that had not existed before. Melinda recognized that remaining inside almost certainly meant death. Acting quickly, she climbed to a second-floor window and jumped. The leap itself carried obvious risks. Falling from a second-story window could result in severe injury. Remaining inside, however, offered virtually no chance of survival. Melinda chose the only option available. After reaching the ground, she called for help, alerting others that a violent attack was underway. For investigators reviewing the case later, this moment became one of the most important turning points in the entire investigation. In many earlier attacks, victims had died before they could summon assistance or identify their attacker. Here, a surviving witness not only escaped, but did so while the suspect remained inside the apartment complex. Her actions compressed the timeline dramatically. Instead of detectives reconstructing events hours after a homicide, police officers now had the opportunity to respond while the suspect was still nearby. Officers arrived quickly after receiving the emergency call. Unlike previous investigations, they were no longer searching for an unknown offender who had already vanished into another neighborhood. According to investigators, Carl Eugene Watts was still at the apartment complex when law enforcement reached the scene. For years, authorities had suspected that one individual might be responsible for multiple unsolved murders across 2 states, but suspicion had repeatedly failed to produce an arrest. On this morning, circumstances changed. Watts was taken into custody at the apartment complex, bringing an abrupt end to the years during which investigators believed he had repeatedly escaped immediate capture after violent attacks. The significance of the arrest extended beyond the events inside Lori Lister's apartment. As investigators continued examining the surrounding area, they made another grim discovery. On that same morning, they found the body of Michelle Mayday in a nearby apartment. According to investigators, she had been drowned in her bathtub. The method of killing closely resembled patterns authorities had previously observed, further strengthening suspicions that the violence occurring in Houston formed part of the same broader sequence investigators had been struggling to understand. The proximity in both time and location between Michelle Mayday's death and Watts' arrest transformed the investigation. What had initially appeared to be separate events now became closely connected in the eyes of detectives attempting to reconstruct the morning's chronology. Michelle Mayday's death also underscored the devastating reality confronting investigators. While Lori Lister and Melinda Aguilar survived the attack through extraordinary circumstances, another woman had lost her life only a short distance away. The discovery reinforced investigators' belief that the violence had not suddenly begun that morning. Instead, they concluded it represented the continuation of a pattern extending back years. Every newly examined case raised additional questions about earlier unsolved murders in both Texas and Michigan. Detectives now faced the enormous task of determining whether the man in custody could be connected to crimes stretching across nearly a decade. The arrest itself marked only the beginning of that process. Having a suspect did not automatically resolve dozens of unsolved investigations. Authorities still needed evidence capable of linking individual cases to Carl Eugene Watts. Witness testimony, physical evidence, timelines, and investigative records all required careful review. Detectives from different jurisdictions began comparing information more closely than ever before, searching for similarities that previously had remained scattered among separate case files. Families who had waited years without answers cautiously hoped that the arrest might finally reveal what had happened to their loved ones. At the same time, investigators understood that expectations had to be tempered by legal realities. Even if they strongly believed Watts was responsible for numerous murders, every individual prosecution required evidence meeting the standards of criminal court. Those standards remained unchanged regardless of the number of cases under consideration. The investigation, therefore, entered a new and extraordinarily complex phase. Instead of searching for an unknown offender, authorities now sought to determine the full extent of the crimes they believed he had committed. As detectives questioned Watts, they hoped years of unanswered questions might finally receive explanations. Which victims had he attacked? How many murders had gone unrecognized as connected? Could long unsolved cases finally be closed? The answers that eventually emerged would prove both remarkable and deeply controversial. Rather than leading directly to multiple murder trials, the legal process took an unexpected direction that would shock investigators, frustrate victims' families, and generate criticism that continued for decades. In an effort to resolve numerous cases, prosecutors would negotiate an agreement unlike any outcome many people expected, one that allowed Carl Eugene Watts to admit responsibility for multiple killings while avoiding prosecution for most of them. That decision would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case and would shape the pursuit of justice long after his arrest in Houston. The arrest of Carl Eugene Watts on May 23, 1982, marked the end of one phase of the investigation, but it immediately opened another that proved just as complicated and, in many ways, far more controversial. Detectives in Texas and Michigan finally had the man they had long suspected might be connected to numerous unsolved murders. Yet possessing a suspect was very different from possessing enough admissible evidence to secure convictions in court. Years had passed since many of the killings. Physical evidence had deteriorated or never existed in the first place. DNA technology was still unavailable, eyewitness testimony was often limited, and many crime scenes had yielded few forensic clues. Investigators believed they were confronting an offender responsible for far more crimes than they could realistically prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Faced with that difficult reality, prosecutors had to decide how to pursue justice while balancing the practical limitations of the legal system. The decision they ultimately reached would remain one of the most criticized aspects of the entire case. Rather than attempting to prosecute Carl Eugene Watts separately for every homicide investigators believed he had committed, Texas prosecutors negotiated an agreement designed to obtain information about numerous unsolved murders while avoiding years of uncertain trials. Under the terms of that agreement, Watts would admit responsibility for multiple killings and cooperate with investigators. In exchange, he would not be prosecuted for the murders he confessed to under the agreement. Instead, he would receive a 60-year prison sentence for burglary with intent to commit murder, a charge arising from the attack that led to his arrest. To many within law enforcement, the proposal reflected a difficult compromise. Prosecutors recognized that proving decades-old homicide cases individually could require enormous resources while still ending in acquittals because of insufficient evidence. By obtaining confessions, they hoped to provide at least some measure of certainty for investigators and, potentially, for families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Yet from the moment details of the agreement became known, many questioned whether the legal system had sacrificed too much. According to the agreement, Carl Eugene Watts confessed to 13 murders. He also assisted investigators by leading them to locations connected with some of the crimes. For detectives who had spent years assembling fragments of evidence, these admissions appeared to confirm long-held suspicions that the murders in Michigan and Texas were not isolated tragedies, but part of a broader pattern extending across nearly a decade. Each confession represented another case investigators believed had finally been linked to the man they had pursued for years. Yet those same confessions also produced an uncomfortable consequence. Because of the agreement, many of the murders Watts admitted committing would never be presented before a jury. Families who had hoped to witness public trials and formal convictions instead watched as legal Negotiations replaced courtroom proceedings. Critics argued that a man suspected of killing dozens of women had effectively avoided prosecution for the overwhelming majority of his alleged crimes. They questioned whether practical efficiency had come at the expense of justice. Others defended the agreement by emphasizing the severe evidentiary challenges facing prosecutors. They argued that unsuccessful murder prosecutions could have resulted in even less accountability if juries acquitted Watts because investigators lacked sufficient forensic proof. The debate reflected two competing visions of justice, one prioritizing the certainty of imprisonment through negotiated resolutions, the other insisting that every possible homicide deserved its own opportunity for trial regardless of the difficulties involved. For the families of victims, the controversy was intensely personal rather than abstract. Many had waited years with little information about unsolved cases. Some finally received confirmation that investigators believed Watts was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Yet confirmation did not necessarily bring closure. Courtroom testimony, public presentation of evidence, and formal murder convictions often play an important role in the grieving process. The agreement meant that many families would never experience those proceedings. Instead, they were left with the knowledge that the man believed responsible for devastating losses had admitted involvement while remaining largely shielded from prosecution for those admissions. Investigators, meanwhile, continued examining the broader implications of Watts' confessions. Even after admitting to 13 murders, questions remained about whether that number reflected the full extent of his crimes. Authorities had long suspected that the true total might be significantly higher. Estimates discussed by investigators frequently ranged between 80 and 90 victims, while some believed the number could exceed 100. These estimates were never proven in court, and no definitive total has ever been established. Nevertheless, the gap between the 13 confessed murders and the much larger number of suspected victims underscored the extraordinary difficulty of reconstructing nearly a decade of violent crime after the fact. One statement attributed to Watts became particularly well known among investigators because it appeared to suggest that the confirmed cases represented only a fraction of the truth. During discussions with investigators, he reportedly remarked, "There are not enough fingers and toes in this room to count how many women I have killed." The statement has been repeated frequently in discussions of the case because it captured the uncertainty surrounding the true number of victims. At the same time, investigators could not simply accept such a remark as proof. Criminal investigations require corroboration, physical evidence, witness testimony, and documentation. Without those elements, the precise number of victims remained impossible to establish. As a result, the question that had haunted detectives since the beginning of the investigation persisted even after Watts entered prison. Exactly how many women had lost their lives at his hands? For several years after the agreement, it appeared that Carl Eugene Watts would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated under the 60-year sentence imposed in Texas. Many assumed that, regardless of the controversy surrounding the plea arrangement, the practical outcome was the same. A lengthy prison term would keep him away from the public for decades, effectively ending any possibility that he could harm additional victims. Yet the legal landscape shifted unexpectedly. Changes in Texas law created the possibility that Watts might become eligible for release far earlier than many investigators and victims' families had anticipated. News of that possibility produced immediate alarm. The idea that a man suspected of dozens of murders could one day leave prison reignited fears that had never completely disappeared. Families who believed justice had already been compromised by the plea agreement now faced the possibility that even the lengthy prison sentence secured through that agreement might not guarantee permanente incarcération. For investigators in Michigan, the potential release transformed old case files into urgent priorities. Detectives realized they could no longer rely upon the Texas sentence alone to ensure that Watts remained imprisoned. If independent murder prosecutions could be supported by evidence not covered under the Texas agreement, Those cases might result in life sentences that would eliminate any possibility of release. Consequently, authorities reopened multiple unsolved homicide investigations dating back to the late 1970s. Every witness statement was reviewed again. Every surviving piece of evidence received renewed attention. Detectives searched for overlooked details capable of supporting charges independent of the Texas plea arrangement. Among those reviewing the evidence was a witness whose observations from years earlier would ultimately become decisive. Joseph Foy had seen a man leaving the area after the murder of Helen Dutcher in Michigan on August 26, 1979. At the time of the original investigation, his testimony alone had not been enough to identify the killer conclusively. Years later, however, he identified Carl Eugene Watts as the man he had seen near the crime scene. Combined with other evidence assembled during the reopened investigation, that identification provided prosecutors with the opportunity they had long sought. The renewed Michigan investigations represented far more than legal strategy. They reflected the determination of investigators and prosecutors to pursue accountability despite the limitations that had frustrated the original cases decades earlier. Rather than accepting the possibility that Watts might eventually leave prison, they returned to unsolved murders one by one, searching patiently for evidence capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. Their efforts would ultimately lead to the murder convictions that had eluded authorities for so many years. Those convictions, secured long after the original crimes, would ensure that Carl Eugene Watts would never again walk free. They would also provide at least some measure of justice for families who had waited decades to hear a court formally declare the man responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. The final chapter of the case, however, would raise one last enduring question: whether any legal outcome could truly account for the vast number of women investigators believed had become victims of one of America's most elusive serial killers. By the early 2000s, nearly 2 decades had passed since Carl Eugene Watts had been taken into custody in Houston. For many people outside law enforcement, his story seemed finished. He had been imprisoned, had confessed to multiple killings under a controversial agreement, and appeared destined to remain behind bars for decades. Yet for investigators in Michigan, the case was far from over. Boxes containing aging reports, witness interviews, photographs, and handwritten notes still filled evidence rooms. Families of victims continued to live with unanswered questions. Detectives who had spent years pursuing the elusive suspect refused to accept that the legal process had reached its conclusion. The possibility that Watts might someday become eligible for release because of changes in Texas law transformed what had once been historical investigations into urgent priorities. If Michigan authorities could develop prosecutable homicide cases that were not covered by the Texas agreement, they could ensure that he remained in prison for the rest of his life. The renewed investigations demanded extraordinary patience. Many of the murders had occurred more than 20 years earlier. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some physical evidence had deteriorated, while other evidence reflected the technological limitations of the late 1970s. Detectives understood that reopening a homicide investigation after so many years required careful attention to every surviving detail. Rather than assuming earlier investigators had failed, they approached the files with fresh eyes, asking whether overlooked evidence or witnesses might now carry greater significance when viewed alongside everything learned after Watts' arrest. One case quickly emerged as particularly promising: the murder of Helen Dutcher. On August 26, 1979, Helen had returned to her apartment, believing she was only moments away from safety. According to investigators, she was suddenly attacked and stabbed numerous times by a man who fled immediately after the assault. At the time, detectives believed the murder resembled several other unsolved attacks on women in Michigan, but they lacked sufficient evidence to identify the offender conclusively. Years later, however, the investigation took on new momentum because one witness had never forgotten what he had seen. Joseph Foy lived near Helen Dutcher's apartment and had observed a man leaving the area shortly After the murder, during the original investigation, his observations alone could not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Like many eyewitnesses to rapidly unfolding events, he had only a brief opportunity to observe the individual. In the years immediately following the crime, that information was valuable but insufficient. However, the passage of time changed the broader context of the investigation. Investigators now possessed years of accumulated evidence, knowledge of Watts' suspected movements, his arrest in Texas, and his confessions to multiple murders. When Joseph Foy later identified Carl Eugene Watts as the man he had seen near Helen Dutcher's apartment, his testimony became far more significant than it had been decades earlier. It no longer stood alone, but formed part of a much larger body of investigative work connecting Watts to similar attacks across multiple jurisdictions. Prosecutors believed they finally possessed a case capable of surviving the scrutiny of a criminal trial. In 2004, Carl Eugene Watts was tried for the murder of Helen Dutcher. The proceedings represented something many families had feared would never happen. A murder case against the man investigators had suspected for decades. Unlike the Texas plea agreement, which resolved numerous allegations without individual murder trials, this prosecution required the evidence to be presented openly before the court. Witness testimony, investigative findings, and the accumulated work of law enforcement over many years came together in an effort to secure justice for a single victim whose case had remained unresolved for nearly a quarter of a century. The outcome marked a turning point. Watts was convicted of Helen Dutcher's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For investigators, the conviction represented validation of years of persistence. It also removed the uncertainty created by the possibility of his release from Texas custody. Even if legal changes affected his earlier sentence, the Michigan conviction ensured that he would remain incarcerated. For Helen Dutcher's family, the verdict brought a measure of accountability that had been delayed for decades. Although no criminal conviction could reverse the loss they had suffered, the judgment publicly acknowledged responsibility for the murder and brought formal legal recognition to a case that had remained unresolved for much of their lives. Yet the work of investigators did not end there. Another case from the earliest period of Watts' suspected crimes continued demanding attention. Gloria Steele had been only 19 years old when she was attacked outside her apartment in September 1974. According to investigators, she had been strangled and stabbed more than 30 times. The murder had long puzzled detectives because there was no evidence of robbery or sexual assault, and the crime scene yielded too little information to identify the offender. For many years, Gloria's death remained one more unsolved homicide among many. As Michigan authorities continued re-examining historical evidence, however, new witness testimony and additional investigative work strengthened the case linking Watts to her murder. The renewed investigation ultimately produced sufficient evidence to bring the case before the courts. In 2007, Carl Eugene Watts was convicted of Gloria Steele's murder and again received a sentence of life imprisonment. The conviction carried profound symbolic significance. Gloria's death had long been regarded by investigators as the earliest known killing connected to Watts. More than 30 years after her life was taken, the legal system finally reached a formal conclusion regarding responsibility for her murder. Although delayed, the conviction reflected the determination of investigators who refused to allow even decades-old cases to disappear into forgotten archives. Ironically, the second conviction came only days before Watts' own life ended. On September 21, 2007, Carl Eugene Watts died in a Michigan prison from prostate cancer at the age of 53. His death permanently ended any possibility of additional criminal prosecutions. It also ensured that many questions surrounding the case would never receive definitive answers. Investigators could no longer question him about unsolved murders. Families whose loved ones remained among the suspected victims lost the opportunity to hear direct admissions or explanations. Whatever knowledge Watts possessed about the full extent of his crimes died with him inside prison. Walls. Even after his death, one question continued to dominate discussions of the case. How many women had Carl Eugene Watts actually killed? The official numbers remain strikingly different depending upon the source. Legally, the answer is straightforward. He was convicted of 2 murders, Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele. Under the Texas agreement, he confessed to 13 killings. Beyond those admissions, however, uncertainty expands dramatically. Investigators frequently stated that they suspected him in approximately 80 to 90 murders. Some detectives believe the true number exceeded 100. None of those larger estimates were ever proven in court, and no comprehensive list of victims has ever been established with certainty. Consequently, historians and criminologists continue describing Watts as one of the most enigmatic serial killers in American history, not because investigators doubted his capacity for violence, but because the available evidence could never definitively determine the full scope of his crimes. One statement attributed to Watts has become inseparable from that uncertainty. During conversations with investigators, he reportedly declared, "There are not enough fingers and toes in this room to count how many women I have killed." Whether interpreted as a boast, an attempt to manipulate investigators, or a truthful indication that many additional victims existed, the remark has never been independently verified through evidence. Detectives could investigate individual disappearances and unsolved homicides, but without corroborating proof, they could not simply transform speculation into criminal certainty. As a result, the statement remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case precisely because it cannot be fully confirmed or completely dismissed. The legacy of Carl Eugene Watts therefore extends beyond the crimes for which he was convicted. His case exposed the enormous difficulties investigators faced before modern forensic science and integrated law enforcement databases transformed homicide investigations. It demonstrated how an offender operating across multiple states could exploit fragmented communication between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the consequences of inconsistent methods of killing, which delayed recognition that numerous apparently unrelated cases might share a common offender. Most importantly, however, the story is not ultimately about Carl Eugene Watts himself. It is about the women whose ordinary routines ended in extraordinary violence, the families who waited years or decades for answers, the witnesses whose memories became vital long after the events they observed, and the investigators who continued pursuing justice despite overwhelming obstacles. Even though 2 murder convictions finally ensured that Watts would never regain his freedom, the unanswered questions surrounding the true number of victims remain a lasting reminder that some chapters of criminal history can never be completely closed. The death of Carl Eugene Watts in 2007 brought an end to the life of a man whose name had been associated with one of the most complex serial murder investigations in American history. Yet his death did not bring complete resolution. For investigators, journalists, and especially the families of victims, the case remained filled with unanswered questions. 2 murder convictions had been secured. 13 killings had been confessed to under a controversial agreement. Dozens more murders had been linked to him by investigators who believed the true number of victims could have been far higher. But the final answer, the exact number of women whose lives ended because of Carl Eugene Watts, remained unknown. In many ways, that uncertainty became the defining feature of the case. It was not simply the story of a serial killer who avoided capture for years. It was the story of how an offender could move through different communities, leave behind separate tragedies, and exploit weaknesses in the investigative systems of the time. It was also a reminder that behind every statistic was a person with a name, a family, and a future that was taken away. When examining the legacy of Carl Eugene Watts, investigators often return to the same question. How had one individual been able to continue for so long without being stopped? The answer was not a single failure or one missed opportunity. Instead, it was the result of multiple challenges that existed during the decades when his crimes occurred. The attacks happened in different locations. Some occurred in Michigan, others in Texas. Different police departments handled different cases, and information did not always move quickly between jurisdictions. A murder investigation in one city might appear unrelated to a homicide hundreds of miles away. Without modern databases and instant communication systems, detectives often worked with only the information immediately available to them. This separation created opportunities for patterns to remain hidden. Another major obstacle was the nature of Watts' alleged crimes themselves. Many serial offenders become identifiable because they repeat the same behavior in a recognizable way. Investigators may discover a specific weapon, a consistent method of attack, or a distinctive pattern left at crime scenes. Watts appeared far more difficult to categorize. According to investigators, he changed methods depending on circumstances. He used different weapons and different approaches, including stabbing, strangulation, attacks involving blunt force, and drowning. This variation made individual cases appear less connected than they actually were. The common factor was not the method. It was the victims. Again and again, investigators found that the women connected to the cases shared certain characteristics. They were often young or middle-aged women. Many were alone when attacked. Many were assaulted near their residences, in moments when they believed they were only seconds away from safety. Their deaths did not appear to be driven by financial motives. Their possessions were usually left behind. Investigators found little evidence suggesting sexual assault was the primary objective. Instead, they concluded that the violence itself appeared to be the central purpose. This understanding changed how detectives viewed the cases. They were not searching for a traditional robber or someone acting out of personal revenge. They were searching for someone who appeared to seek control over vulnerable victims in moments of opportunity. That realization, however, did not immediately provide the evidence needed for prosecution. Suspicion and probability are powerful investigative tools, but courts require proof. The difference between believing someone committed a crime and proving it beyond a reasonable doubt became one of the greatest challenges throughout the Watts investigation. This gap was particularly visible after his arrest in 1982. Investigators believed they had captured a man responsible for numerous murders, but many individual cases lacked the physical evidence necessary for conviction. The Texas Agreement became the solution chosen by prosecutors, but it also became the source of lasting controversy. By allowing Watts to confess to 13 murders in exchange for avoiding prosecution for those crimes, authorities gained valuable information and ensured that he remained imprisoned. Yet many critics argued that justice had been incomplete. They believed each victim deserved a separate trial and a formal conviction acknowledging the individual crime committed against them. For families of victims, the emotional impact was complicated. Learning that Watts had confessed may have answered some questions, but it could never undo the years of uncertainty or replace the opportunity to see justice delivered in a courtroom. Some families received information about what investigators believed happened to their loved ones, while others continued living with uncertainty about whether their family members were among the suspected victims. The possibility that dozens of additional murders remained unresolved created a painful reality. Even after the offender's death, many stories remained unfinished. The case also became an example of the limitations of relying on confessions alone. While Watts admitted responsibility for multiple murders, investigators understood that every statement required verification. A confession without supporting evidence could not automatically establish the truth of every claim. This was especially important in a case where the alleged number of victims was extraordinarily high. Authorities could not simply assign every unsolved homicide to Watts without evidence connecting him to the crime. Each case required its own examination, and many could never reach the level of certainty required for prosecution. The convictions obtained in Michigan demonstrated the importance of continuing those investigations. The murders of Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele had remained unresolved for decades, but persistent work by investigators eventually produced the evidence needed to bring both cases to court. Those convictions served as reminders that old cases are not necessarily forgotten cases. Witness mémoire, investigative technique, and renewed attention can sometimes transform cases that once seemed impossible to solve. For the families of Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele, those verdicts represented a form of recognition that had been delayed for many years. The courts officially acknowledged the responsibility of the person who had taken their loved ones away. Yet even with those convictions, the larger mystery surrounding Watts remained. If investigators were correct that he might have been responsible for 80, 90, or even more than 100 murders, then the vast majority of those victims never received the same legal acknowledgement. Their names remained separate from the official record. Their cases remained connected only through investigative belief rather than courtroom proof. This uncertainty is one of the most difficult aspects of the Watts case to understand. Numbers can communicate the scale of a crime, but they can also hide the individual suffering behind them. Saying that investigators suspected dozens of victims does not fully describe the loss experienced by each family. Every victim represented a person who had relationships, memories, and plans for the future. Every unsolved case represented someone who deserved answers. The story of Carl Eugene Watts, therefore, cannot be reduced only to the actions of the offender. It must also include the lives of those affected by those actions. It includes the families who waited for answers, the investigators who continued searching through old files, and the communities that lived with fear while an unknown attacker remained free. It includes the witnesses whose small observations became important years later, and the victims, whose names must remain at the center of the discussion. The case also serves as a historical example of how criminal investigations have changed over time. Today, law enforcement agencies have access to advanced forensic technology, national databases, and faster communication systems. These tools do not eliminate every challenge, but they make it more difficult for patterns of repeated violence to remain hidden. The Watts investigation occurred during a different era, when detectives often relied heavily on experience, persistence, and the ability to recognize connections manually. The failures and successes of the case both influenced how future investigations would be approached. In the end, Carl Eugene Watts died in prison without ever providing a complete account of his crimes. The unanswered questions surrounding his alleged victims became part of his legacy, but they should not overshadow the people whose lives were lost. The most important lesson from this case is not the mystery of the killer's mind. It is the importance of remembering the victims and understanding the human cost behind every investigation. Carl Eugene Watts became known as the Sunday morning slasher, but the women whose lives were taken were more than names in a criminal file. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and members of communities that continued carrying their absence long after the headlines disappeared. The final chapter of this case remains incomplete because the full truth may never be known. But the pursuit of that truth and the effort to honor those who were lost remains the most enduring part of the story. The story of Carl Eugene Watts remains one of the most unsettling examples of how a serial offender can exist within ordinary society while leaving behind a trail of devastation that investigators may not fully understand for decades. Even after his death, the questions surrounding him continue to challenge law enforcement, criminologists, and those who study patterns of violent crime. His case was not defined only by the crimes for which he was convicted, but also by the vast uncertainty surrounding the crimes that could never be proven in court. The difference between what was legally established and what investigators believed happened became the central tension of the entire investigation. 2 murders resulted in convictions. 13 murders were admitted through a negotiated agreement. Yet the possibility of dozens more victims created a shadow that extended far beyond the courtroom. The unresolved nature of the case forced investigators and the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the complete truth about a crime may remain permanently out of reach. One of the most difficult aspects of understanding Watts is the contrast between his outward appearance and the violence attributed to him Throughout much of his life, he did not fit the image many people expect when they imagine a dangerous offender. He was not known as a public figure seeking attention. He did not create a reputation through threats or dramatic displays of aggression. Instead, those who knew him described someone quiet, isolated, and often difficult to read. As a student at Western Michigan University, he blended into the background. He attended classes, interacted minimally with others, and gave little indication of the crimes investigators would later associate with him. This ability to remain unnoticed became one of the most important factors in his ability to avoid detection. The investigation into Watts also demonstrated the difficulty of identifying offenders whose crimes lack a clear traditional motive. In many homicide cases, detectives begin by searching for relationships. They examine family conflicts, financial disputes, personal rivalries, or other circumstances that might explain why one person would target another. The murders connected to Watts often provided none of those answers. The victims generally did not appear to know their attacker. There was little evidence of robbery. There was usually no obvious personal connection. This randomness made the crimes particularly frightening because it meant that traditional methods of prevention were less effective. The victims were not targeted because of something they had done. According to investigators, they were often simply individuals who encountered the wrong person at the wrong time. That unpredictability affected entire communities. Fear spread because the threat did not appear limited to one neighborhood or one type of victim. Women became more cautious about returning home alone. Apartment entrances, parking areas, and ordinary daily routines became associated with potential danger. The psychological impact of an unknown attacker was significant because residents could not easily identify or avoid the threat. The person responsible could appear ordinary, move through familiar environments, and disappear before anyone understood what had happened. For investigators, the challenge was not only finding a suspect, but also proving that seemingly separate crimes belonged to the same offender. The murders occurred across different states and involved different circumstances. Without modern investigative tools, linking cases required careful comparison of details, witness information, and behavioral patterns. The lack of a consistent method made that process even more difficult. A stabbing in one location, a drowning in another, and an attack involving strangulation elsewhere could appear unrelated unless detectives looked beyond the immediate circumstances. The eventual connection between these cases represented years of investigative effort rather than a single breakthrough. The case also highlighted the importance and limitations of eyewitness testimony. Several witnesses provided information that became significant long after the original crimes occurred. Joseph Foy's identification of Watts in connection with Helen Dutcher's murder demonstrated how a memory that initially seemed insufficient could gain importance when combined with additional evidence years later. However, eyewitness testimony is also complicated by the passage of time. Memories can fade, details can change, and investigators must carefully evaluate how reliable each identification is. The fact that Watts was ultimately convicted in Michigan decades after the murder showed both the persistence of investigators and the difficulty of achieving justice after such a long delay. The legal journey of Carl Eugene Watts also remains controversial because it raised fundamental questions about the purpose of criminal justice. The Texas Agreement represented a practical decision. Prosecutors wanted information. They wanted accountability. They wanted to ensure that Watts remained behind bars. But the agreement also meant that many alleged murders never received individual trials. For some families, the resolution provided answers. For others, it felt incomplete. A confession and a prison sentence could never replace the opportunity to see a jury evaluate the evidence surrounding each victim's death. The controversy surrounding the agreement continued long after Watts entered prison because it reflected a larger debate faced by prosecutors in difficult cases. Should the justice system pursue every possible charge even when evidence is uncertain? Or should it accept a guaranteed conviction that prevents future harm? There is no simple answer. Every decision carries consequences, particularly when the crimes involve multiple victims and decades of unanswered questions. The Watts case remains a powerful example of those competing priorities. Another lasting question concerns the number of victims. Estimates that Watts may have killed 80, 90, or even more than 100 women are among the most frequently discussed aspects of his case. These numbers, however, exist primarily within investigative belief rather than confirmed legal records. They represent the suspicions of detectives who examined patterns and compared cases, but they do not represent convictions. This distinction is essential because every victim deserves accuracy. Assigning responsibility without evidence risks replacing one injustice with another. At the same time, ignoring investigative conclusions would also overlook the work of those who spent years studying the connections between cases. The uncertainty surrounding the victim count, therefore, remains one of the most complex parts of Watts' legacy. His own statements contributed to that uncertainty. The remark attributed to him about there not being enough fingers and toes to count his victims became one of the most repeated quotations connected to the case. Yet even this statement reflects the difficulty of understanding Watts himself. Was it an accurate confession? An attempt to shock investigators? An exaggeration designed to create fear? Without the ability to verify every claim, investigators were left with unanswered questions. His death from prostate cancer in 2007 permanently removed the possibility of obtaining additional information directly from him. The victims' families, however, continued carrying the consequences of those unanswered questions. For families connected to confirmed victims, convictions provided a form of acknowledgement. But for those whose loved ones disappeared or whose cases remained unresolved, uncertainty remained part of their lives. The passage of time does not erase the need for answers. A case file may eventually become inactive, but the loss experienced by families continues. This is why investigations into historical crimes remain important. They are not only about statistics or legal outcomes. They are about recognizing the lives behind the records. The legacy of Carl Eugene Watts also extends into the study of criminal investigation itself. His case demonstrated the importance of communication between law enforcement agencies, the value of reviewing old evidence, and the need for investigators to recognize patterns across separate jurisdictions. It showed how an offender can exploit gaps between agencies and how advances in technology can transform investigations that once seemed impossible. The case belongs to a period before many modern forensic tools became widely available, a time when detectives often relied on persistence, interviews, and careful analysis rather than digital evidence. Ultimately, the story of Carl Eugene Watts is not defined by the mystery of how many victims he may have had. It is defined by the lives interrupted and the people left behind. The name Sunday Morning Slasher became associated with fear. But the victims were never symbols of a criminal investigation. They were individuals who deserved to be remembered beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Their stories represent the human cost behind every statistic. Their families represent the lasting impact of violence that extends far beyond the moment a crime occurs. Decades after the investigations began, the full truth about Carl Eugene Watts may never be completely known. Some questions disappeared with him when he died in prison. But the pursuit of justice, the dedication of investigators, and the memory of those who lost their lives remain the most important parts of this case. The unanswered questions are significant, but they should never become more important than the people at the center of the tragedy. The final chapter of the Carl Eugene Watts case is not a story of complete answers. It is a story of what remained unknown, of what investigators were able to prove, and of what may never be fully understood. When Watts died inside a Michigan prison on September 21, 2007, from prostate cancer at the age of 53, the legal system had reached its final opportunity to hold him accountable. He had been convicted of the murders of Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele, He had confessed to 13 killings through a controversial agreement in Texas. He had spent the last years of his life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. Yet his death also closed a door that could never be reopened. Investigators could no longer question him. Families could no longer hope for additional information from his own words. Any secrets he carried about the full extent of his crimes disappeared with him. What remained was a complicated legacy, a case that demonstrated both the determination of investigators and the limitations of the justice system when confronting a crime spanning multiple years, multiple states, and potentially dozens of victims. For the families affected by the crimes associated with Watts, the conclusion was never simple. A conviction can provide recognition. It can formally establish responsibility. It can confirm that the person accused of causing unimaginable loss has been held accountable. But a conviction cannot restore a life. It cannot erase the years spent waiting for answers. It cannot remove the pain of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that continue without someone who should have been there. For the families of confirmed victims, justice arrived after decades of uncertainty. For others whose loved ones may have been among the suspected victims, uncertainty remained. The possibility that many women were killed but never identified as victims of Watts created an especially painful reality. Their stories remained incomplete, existing somewhere between suspicion and proof. Investigators believed connections existed. Patterns suggested additional victims. But without evidence strong enough for prosecution, those cases remained unresolved. This distinction between belief and proof is one of the most important elements of the Watts investigation. Throughout the case, detectives repeatedly faced the same challenge. They could suspect, but they had to prove. They could recognize similarities between crimes, but they needed evidence linking a specific individual to a specific victim. They could believe that Watts was responsible for many more deaths, but they could not transform every suspicion into a criminal conviction. The justice system required a higher standard. That standard protected the innocent, but it also meant that some victims never received the courtroom acknowledgement their families hoped for. The Watts investigation became an example of how difficult serial murder cases can be when they develop over time rather than through one obvious pattern. At the beginning, investigators did not know they were looking for a serial offender. They saw individual tragedies. A woman killed near her home. Another attacked in a different neighborhood. Another victim discovered under different circumstances. Only after examining the cases together did the possibility of a larger pattern emerge. This gradual recognition is common in complex investigations because offenders rarely announce their presence. They rely on confusion, separation between cases, and the assumption that each crime has its own explanation. Watts' case showed how important it is for investigators to compare information across jurisdictions. A homicide department working alone may see only one piece of a larger picture. Another department may hold another piece. Without communication and cooperation, the complete pattern may remain hidden. The case also represented a turning point in how law enforcement viewed the importance of long-term investigative work. The murders connected to Watts occurred during an era when many of the technologies considered essential today were unavailable. DNA analysis had not yet become a standard investigative tool. Digital records did not allow investigators to instantly compare cases across the country. Surveillance technology was limited. Detectives relied heavily on interviews, witness accounts, physical evidence available at the scene, and their ability to recognize connections through careful analysis. In this environment, persistence became one of the most important tools available. The investigators who continued working on old cases demonstrated that time does not always eliminate the possibility of justice. The convictions for Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele were achieved decades after the crimes occurred, because investigators returned to the evidence rather than accepting that the cases were permanently unsolvable. Those convictions carried a message beyond the courtroom. Unresolved cases still matter. The passage of years does not reduce the value of a victim's life or the importance of accountability. At the same time, the Watts case remains a reminder that justice does not always produce complete closure. Even after convictions, questions remained. The exact number of victims was never established. The full timeline of Watts' alleged crimes remained uncertain. Some families never received definitive answers. Some investigators continued believing that additional victims existed. The case ended legally, but not completely emotionally or historically. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Carl Eugene Watts' story is the possibility that the known crimes represented only a portion of his actions. The difference between 13 confessed murders and the much larger estimates suggested by some investigators created one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the case. If those estimates were accurate, then many victims may never have been identified. Their families may never have known what happened. Their names may never have appeared in court records. However, because those numbers could not be fully proven, they remain estimates rather than established facts. This uncertainty is difficult because it exists between two realities. On one side are the investigators who studied the evidence and believed the pattern was much larger than the official convictions. On the other side is the legal requirement for evidence strong enough to establish responsibility. Both perspectives represent important parts of the truth. One focuses on investigative understanding. The other focuses on legal certainty. The tragedy is that sometimes those two forms of truth do not completely overlap. The story of Carl Eugene Watts is also a reminder of the importance of remembering victims, separately from the person who harmed them. True crime discussions often focus heavily on offenders, their backgrounds, their behavior, their methods, and their psychology. While understanding offenders can help investigators and society learn from past cases, there is a danger that the victims become secondary characters in their own stories. The women connected to the Watts investigation were not simply names in police reports. They were individuals with families, relationships, goals, and experiences that existed long before they became part of a criminal investigation. Their lives deserve attention beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The greatest responsibility in telling cases like this is ensuring that the victims remain at the center. Carl Eugene Watts became known through a nickname given by newspapers, the Sunday Morning Slasher. That name captured public fear, but it did not represent the full story. The full story includes the communities affected by fear, the investigators who searched for answers, the witnesses who carried memories for decades, and the families who continued living with loss. It includes the legal debates created by the plea agreement and the questions raised about how society responds when evidence is incomplete but suspicion is overwhelming. Ultimately, the case of Carl Eugene Watts remains one of the most haunting examples of the challenges involved in investigating serial murder. It demonstrates how one offender can exploit weaknesses in communication, technology, and investigative resources. It shows the importance of cooperation between agencies and the value of continuing to pursue answers even when years have passed. But above all, it demonstrates the human cost of violence. The number of victims may never be known. The complete story of every crime may never be recovered. Yet the impact of those losses remains real. The women whose lives ended because of Watts' actions remain the most important part of the story. Their families' search for answers represents the true emotional center of the case. The unanswered questions surrounding Carl Eugene Watts may continue forever. But the pursuit of truth and the remembrance of those who were lost remain the lasting lessons of this tragedy.